Hello. I hope you enjoy this. I've been working on it for a while. I don't really have the money to afford traditional publishing, so I'm just going to have to make this a podcast and hope and pray that people enjoy it. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thank you.
East Port, Greenside Port. It was early morning when the ship finally docked. The spray of the ocean was still beating against the belly of the ship and the thick wooden docks. Heavy clouds hung around the mountains. The Godson slowly stepped off the steamship towards the mountains that will be their new home in the frontier. Their clean clothes still smelled of the clear, salty air from months of being on the open ocean. Their young daughter looked around at the heavy reinforced buildings built like small forts standing tall in the mud. The heavy timber and limestone blocks were deeply scarred by years of heavy rain and sunlight. The pungent scent of mud, coal smoke, sweat and pine assaulted her little nose. The people towered over her small frame as they moved about their labor on the docks. She looked up at the massive country flag. 8 white stars on a blue square with red and white vertical stripes waving in the heavy breeze. The laborers moved like clockwork, as if the people stepping off the steamships did not even catch their eye. The massive steam cranes looked more akin to smoking towers to her as they lift massive wooden crates onto ships. Even as young as she was, she knew some of the cargo was likely being shipped back to her home country. She feared that if she let go of her mother's hand, she would be swept away by the wind or the wave of people trying to get off the docks. Little Sophia wished they were back home instead of here. Everything was too tall or too heavy, but mainly it was too loud. Not the loud she had grown accustomed to back home. The mountains and the ancient trees that surrounded those ancient stones were like nothing she had ever seen before. Her mother, Hilda, carefully squeezed little Sophia's hand, partially to reassure and to not lose her daughter to the crowd of people. This way, her father Wilson called out, waving them to follow. Hilda pulled little Sophia through the crowd towards Wilson, slowly moving with the wave of people heading off the docks. Yes, this is our wagon. I have the papers right here, sir. Sophia heard her father's voice from behind some people. Sophia and her mother found Wilson talking to an older dock worker who was chewing on a cigar. The dock worker just looked over the papers Wilson gave him, his tired eyes scanning the ink. He rubbed the dark circles around his eyes with the back of his leather hand before handing Wilson back the papers. Be careful, please. That crate has the good plates and silverware, Hilda cried out, as the men who looked like one of them could eat little Sophia and still be hungry moved the Godson's belongings and history onto the wagon. The men stopped, crates in hand, and stared at Hilda. Their eyes quietly said, "Madam, please just let us do our job," louder than words ever could. "Look, we don't have field guides. We don't do field guides. It's the dock, sir. You and yours are just the latest suckers I've had to deal with this week. You were sold a false bill of goods. The shipping guild is hunting down that fraudster now. The Hunters Guild Hall is 8 doors down on the left. Look for the guild crest hanging off the porch. They've got several racks of elk and deer antlers mounted onto the front wall. You can't miss it. They have field guides for hire. See if you can get one there. We'll have you loaded up in an hour, in a half an hour," the man said as he produced a box of matches, pulled one, and lit his cigar, turning his back to Wilson, the conversation clearly over to him. "What was that about?" Hilda asked as Wilson walked over to them and pointed down the street. "They don't do field guides here, honey. We'll have to go down to the Hunters Guild and see if we can find a reliable escort for us, I'm afraid. Apparently we're not the only ones who were sold this lie that they would already have guides at the docks to lead us to Huntersville," Wilson said, reaching over, petting Sophia's little shoulder. He was trying to reassure her, and partly to reassure himself, that everything was going to be fine in their new home. Wilson took Sophia's hand and calmly led them down the street. If Sophia thought that the docks were loud, she had no idea what the settlement would sound like. The horses were massive, barrel-chested, gorgeous, strong legs, wrapped up in thick, half-hooded rain cloaks with some weird rubbery texture wrappings around their legs, a material she had never seen before. The mud instantly swallowed up to her shoes and came up almost past her boots, as if the very ground itself was trying to swallow her whole. Still, she had managed to finally see those fortresses standing in the mud, shops, mail service, salons, and all sorts of businesses thriving in this port town. It was slightly strange to her, so familiar yet so alien all at the same time. These weren't the pretty, polished, grimy stone buildings that she had grown accustomed to in her home country. The great empire was simply long gone on the other side of the deep blue ocean now. She still had no idea why exactly her father and mother decided to pack up their home and start anew in this frontier where there are truly no jobs left in their home empire that her father or mother could do. Did she have to leave behind all the people she knew? The sweet old lady down the street who always made the best pumpkin pies every autumn. The steady young male milkman who always delivered on time every day, as sure as the bell tower in the distance would ring. Part of her wanted to go back home, to leave this mad world where everything was so familiar. Oh, everything looks so familiar, but still felt wrong. It was as if this very settlement simply forced its way through the mud and muck. These people seeming less like her fellow men and more like an alien species carved out of the very ancient stones they called home. All of them were beaten, weathered, their skin like leather. There were several strange, queer smells she had never encountered before, but above all, she just felt very, very small. When they finally arrived at the guild halls, the Hunters Guild crest, the Hunter's crest swung proudly. An ancient slab of ironwood just off the porch. That ancient crest that even she knew. She had learned about it in her school books. Every child and adult knew that emblem, the white stag surrounded by a wreath of holly. She had learned it. She had known it. She had learned it, but she had never given much thought to what it signified. It was old, going back to when the great empire was nothing more than a simple kingdom, so far from home, so strange and so wrong, yet still that crest remained the same, weathered and worn on that ancient slab of wood. Before they even reached the door, they could hear the piano, the rhythmic tinning sounds of a mechanical crank-up piano playing bar music, playing against the wall. It was just background noise, something to fill the space between the voices of several men and women talking almost in unison. She could not make out any distinct conversations, just a flood of noise. Her father opened the door for her and her mother to step in, then followed behind and pulled it shut. He led the way through the rowdy men, all of them armed, all bearing the Hunters Guild's crest right above their hearts. It was stitched in to the heavy fabric of their coats and stamped onto their very guns they carried. The crest was worn down to the point to where it was barely even noticeable, but still there all the same. It was the same insignia that was hot stamped onto that ancient slab of wood hanging above the porch. Wilson led them towards the counter where a young, beautiful red-headed woman sat in the traditional uniform of the handlers. She was there to hand out the quests and jobs available for the rowdy men surrounding the dining tables. A gentle, warm fire glowing in the hearth. Around the walls were several newspaper clippings of hunters and their trophies, taxidermy decorations hung on the walls. With bear heads, deer skulls, elk antlers, and creatures she had never seen before that must call this mountain their home. As they approached the counter, two of the hunters stood screaming about a job. One claimed the other was lying, that he did not, in fact, hunt down that wingless griffin on the west bypass. The other insisted that it was his bullet that felled. The beast shot right through its heart. Good morning, sir. How may I help you today? The handler asked, looking at Wilson. Her eyes told more than she did. She looked at the Godson family as if they were a foreign species. Yes, we need a field guide to take us to Huntersville, please. Do you have anyone who can do it? We only have $3.50 to spare, Wilson explained with a heavy heart. They had spent the majority of their money to leave the empire behind and start anew in this frontier. They had been promised that their sailing fee included a trail guide to their new home as part of a bundle, but that was apparently a lie. The few men who were nearby immediately chuckled, trying to stifle a laugh at such a ridiculously low price. As Hilda looked at the table, they immediately looked away, as if not to draw attention to the family's desperation. I'm sorry, sir. We simply don't have anyone who would take such a job for such a low price at this time. You might want to wait a few days to see what the guild can do for you, but please, I insist, you do not try to take the mountain path by yourself, especially if you do not know the way. I'm going to guess that you were sold a false bill of goods and were told that the Hunters Guild would already have an expert field guide waiting to meet you on the docks, the handler explained calmly and patiently with that sickening, sweet, warm smile that never faltered, but her eyes were hollow and dead, as if she had done this more times than she cared to count. Wilson just gave a silent nod. There were no words he could say to this. He was so desperate to leave the empire behind that he honestly believed that there would be an expert field guide as part of their sailing fee. As the two rowdy hunters' argument grew more heated, they began snarling, eventually lunging towards to seize each other's waistcoats. Wilson immediately put himself between the two men and his wife and daughter, as the other hunters simply sat and watched, some quietly taking bets as to who would be the last man standing this time. One of them, with a scar over his right eye, grabbed his beer mug. He was about to use it as a bludgeoning weapon, while one was already rearing back his right fist, about to swing with every ounce of strength he had in those 3 fingers on his right hand. Then the door gracefully swung open. A massive brute of a man loomed in the threshold. His shadow engulfed the room like an eclipse. He looked as though he had been hewed out of the very mountain itself, almost 7 feet tall to an inch, broad-shouldered and barrel-chested, wearing a rain poncho made out of what looked like the same rubbery hide, the same material that all the horse legs were wrappings. Yeah. Same material that all the horses' legs wrappings were made of. The same material, though little Sophia did not know what it was. She noticed the heavy, earthy smell coming from the rain poncho. It was like the smell of river muck in foul water. His hood was up, and his face was covered with a heavy cotton face mask that covered his nose and jaw. Sophia had read in stories about a room going silent when someone stepped in, but she had never seen it before today. Of course, she was still not convinced this was even a man. It looked more akin to a tamed beast that belonged to the Hunters Guild. He stepped forward with a heavy thud, thud, thud of his boots as he walked. The very floorboards he stepped on screamed in protest under his weight. He simply reached up his hands to chest level and cracked his knuckles, sounding like ancient oak snapping in a gale. The men in front of him, the same two, that were about to go to blows, immediately let go of the other and quietly and calmly reclaimed their seats. The man with the 3 fingers just sat there in his chair. He rested his head on his 3 fingers, looking at his plate of half-eaten ribs. The man with the scar over his eye sat down and placed his beer mug on the table and began to attentively studying a stain on the hardwood table. Still that heavy thud, thud, thud of the brute's boots digging into the heavy wooden floorboards, as if at any moment the very floor would give way under his mass. He didn't even seem to notice the Godson family. Wilson and Hilda looked up at this massive mountain of a man who stood more than head and shoulders over them and made little Sophia look like a doll had come to life in comparison. The beast had stepped forward in front of the handler For a brief moment, only the wind outside and the mechanical piano still playing a tune were the only sounds in the halls. Little Sophia's heart was beating so fast that she feared it would burst out of her chest at the sight of what she thought was a beast of the mountains that had simply learned to walk upright like a man. The Dakota gang has been dealt with. The North Pass is now clear. The brute said, his voice like stones scraping together. Once this declaration was pronounced, he merely turned around, his shoulders square with the door, and seemed as if he would head back out into the very midst of the mountains that spawned him into this world. "Wait a moment, please, Mr. Bowman," the handler cried out, softly and sweetly. The brute paused, and the heavy thudding stopped as he slowly turned back around to face her, his hazel eyes, green and brown, locked onto her. A hot breath forced through his cotton face wrap. "Unfortunately, Jonathan, this is the newest delivery of that fraudster from overseas. I know you're exhausted and you've more than earned your rest after dealing with the Dakota gang, but you and I both know these people won't last 2 weeks on the high trails without you. They need to get to Huntersville. It's a 4-week trip around the mountain, and the most they can offer is $3.50. I understand you wish to go home, but Jonathan, you and I both know that they will not survive 2 weeks on those trails," the handler explained to the brute who just stood there and stared at her. The Godson family found themselves in almost stark terror as the brute's heads now turned towards them. His eyes seemed to weigh each one of them. Wilson, Hilda, then little Sophia. With those heavy eyes slowly falling onto Sophia, they seemed to be studying her as if she were a living doll. She stood there, shaking like a leaf in a windstorm, clinging desperately to her mother's hand. The giant's gaze drifted back to the handler. The slow creak of his neck sounded like glass rods steadily cracking. Their eyes locked together in a silent conversation that to the Godsons felt like a slow eternity. The heavy earthy smell coming from his rain poncho hung in the air. Part of them prayed the beast would refuse. They knew the truth. Without a guide, the trails would be their grave. "Are you sure there are no other guides available, miss? We can wait a few weeks if we must," Hilda pleaded, squeezing Sophia's hand. She feared letting this hulking titan take them onto those mountain trails. "I can assure you that Mr. Jonathan Bowman here is a silver-ranked hunter. He's one of the best we have, with one of the highest success rates of anyone presently here for a budget. As long as you follow his rules and do exactly what he says on those trails, I can guarantee you will reach Huntersville," the handler said with a sickening sweet voice. and a warm, pleasant smile that reached her ears on her face. Rule 1. No drinking while on the trails. You can use alcohol to cure meat and sanitize wounds, but you will not drink alcohol with me. Rule 2. When I say stop, we stop. When I say we wait, we wait. Rule 3. You will never touch any plant on the trails. You do not eat anything other than what I bring or anything other than what you bring or what I give you. Rule 4. I would rather have a live coward than a dead hero any day of the week. Can you follow those rules or not? Jonathan stated, looking Wilson in his eyes. Wilson looked at Hilda and Sophia. This seemed to be their best bet, our best and only chance now. He let out a heavy breath, then silently nodded his head. All right. Where's your wagon? Jonathan said, through a heavy breath that sounded like a growl from his chest. Jonathan's head and shoulders slumped, resigning himself to the job at hand. He pulled his hood back and pulled down his face wrap. Showing his face. Clean stubble covered his head and face, but the one thing the Godson's family saw was the massive scar on his face. His right cheek was completely ripped off right below his right eye at one point and regrown back. The start of the scar looked like it was not fangs that bit him, but human teeth. But how could a man's mouth open wide enough to bite a giant's face? Sophia stood, frozen, her eyes wide, as she stared at the jagged ruins of his cheek. And to her, Jonathan was an unstoppable mountain, a force that the world simply moved around. But seeing that scar, seeing the clear, unmistakable shape of human teeth marks onto his skin changed everything. It didn't just humanize the giant, it made the trails ahead look like a gaping maw. If something out there could do that to a man who cracked his knuckles like snapping oaks, what chance did her father or her mother or she have? The stark terror she felt before was nothing compared to the cold, hollow dread that now settled in her chest. He slowly reached out his hand towards Wilson, who just looked at Jonathan's wide-open paw, then back to the handler, still smiling at him. As Wilson reached out his hand, Jonathan grabbed Wilson's forearm and firmly shook it. "Thank you, Johnny," the handler said, getting back to work. Jonathan's eyes slowly shifted down as he saw little Sophia. Her eyes were locked on to his scar, frozen in terror. He turned his head and his voice softened slightly. "Wendigo bite," he stated. What? Sophia stammered, her brain still trying to process what he just said, Jonathan spoke again with that same soft, gravelly voice. A wendigo bit me. I managed to wrestle it off me, but it took a part of me with it. As I squared up against the frozen devil, ready to fight for my very life, a 200-pound widowmaker came charging in from nowhere and headbutted that frozen devil right off the side of the mountain. I traded one starving soul for a 200-pound iron wool mountain goat who really, really did not want me on his lawn. Jonathan explained before gesturing towards the door. If you don't mind me asking, what is a widowmaker goat? Sophia asked. Jonathan's voice didn't change as he tilted his head slightly. We call them widowmakers because they'll headbutt you off the side of the mountain. The grass up there is rich in iron. They've been eating it for generations. Because it's so rich in iron, their wool has taken on a rusty red color and is as strong as iron. That's why we call it iron wool. And if you ever hear their horns locking, it'll sound like two anvils being smashed together. They're herbivores, yes. That means they eat grass and plants, but they're very, very territorial and very aggressive. They really do not like house guests at any time of the year, Jonathan explained to her. Seeing the fear on little Sophia, he smiled at her. Don't worry, little lady. Those frozen devils only come out during winter, and the widowmakers only live at the high ends of the peaks. We're not going anywhere near there, and it's not winter, so we don't have to worry about those frozen devils. Jonathan explained, trying to reassure her. Sorry, I had to catch my breath. If you don't mind me asking, what is a wendigo, sir? Sophia asked, looking at his scar. Jonathan closed his eyes and took a deep breath, exhaling slowly. Sadly, little lady, they're what happens when people during winter, when you resort to cannibalism to survive. That means eating your fellow man, which is one of the greatest forms of blasphemy in our Father's eyes. It's spring now. They've either crawled back into the caves to sleep, or they've simply crawled back into the earth. Go ahead and put those frozen devils out of your mind, little lady, Jonathan explained to her. Come on now, Sophia, let's not pester the poor man, Wilson explained, grabbing her hand. Come on, Hilda. We're in the best capable hands, isn't that right, Mr. Bowman? Wilson added. In about 4 to 6 weeks, I completely skipped a chapter, didn't I? Hilda, we're in the best capable hands, isn't that right, Mr. Bowman? In about 4 to 6 weeks, if the weather stays nice, Yeah, I messed up. My cursor slid down, and I completely missed an entire sentence there. All right, back up. Come on now, Sophia, let's not pester the poor man, Wilson explained, grabbing her hand. Come on, Hilda. We're in the best capable hands. Isn't that right, Mr. Bowman? We'll be in Huntersville in no time. Isn't that right? Wilson added. In about 4 to 6 weeks, if the weather stays nice. Come on, we're burning good daylight in the early morning hours, Jonathan replied, once again gesturing towards the door, waiting for them to take the lead. Outside, little Sophia saw the most perplexing sight. There was a massive, heavy draft horse wearing a similar half-hooded rain cloak and leg wrappings made out of that same rubbery hide. Its saddle was wide and weathered. The saddlebags behind it were also made of the same material. But what caught her eye most was the hooded rifle scabbard on the right side of the saddle. What confused her even more was the beast was mouthing on a lacy stuffed bear while wearing a derby hat. Jonathan walked up and took the reins of the horse. This is my big baby, Biscuit. Biscuit, this is the Godson family. Godsons, this is Biscuit. Jonathan said, doing the traditional back and forth motion with his hand. We're going to make a slight detour to Huntersville before we can go home. Be a good boy, Biscuit, Jonathan added, petting the horse's muscular neck. Why the hell did you name this beast Biscuit? Hilda asked before realizing how her question sounded. Jonathan simply looked her in the eyes and tilted his head with that same patient, gravelly voice. He stated, because Biscuit simply loves biscuits. Now let's go inspect that wagon, he said, gesturing towards the docks. Jonathan and Biscuit followed behind the Godsons as they headed back to the docks. As they walked through the town, the Godsons couldn't help but notice all the men and women were taking off their hats or headwear the moment they saw Biscuit walking behind them. One lady even shoved her new bonnet into her shirt just to keep it out of the horse's eyesight. Sophia looked back at Biscuit. That silly little derby hat was still sitting atop his head as he continued mouthing the stuffed bear. Jonathan just closed his eyes and rubbed the bridge of his nose as if this was a simple daily occurrence for them everywhere they went, or at least to those who knew them. Once they arrived back at the docks, Wilson gestured to the wagon. A beautiful black and white foxtrotter was already hooked up to the thin, sturdy wagon. This is the family horse Carrot. We brought her from overseas with us, and this is our wagon, Wilson proclaimed, showing Jonathan their wagon. Jonathan simply froze in place, examining the wagon, the horse, the wheels. He slowly rubbed his face and shook his head. I'm sorry to tell you this, folks. 1, that horse is not going to survive the trip. 2, that wagon is going to get stuck in the mud or break down within a week of us leaving town. I want you to go ahead and keep your sentimentals, but everything else needs to go. The only things that needs to be on the wagon are 6 weeks worth of food and enough water to last 6 weeks on the trails. And go ahead and throw any silver dollars you've got into the barrels when we get them. Now, I've got a good buddy, Bill, who owes me a favor. He already has a wagon that can survive the trip, and he's been meaning to get rid of his gypsy banner. We'll see if he's interested in a trade, Jonathan stated matter-of-factly. Jonathan's words hit like a heavy punch to their gut. He was telling them to trade off what little of their belongings they had left from the trip here, and wanting them to trade off their beloved family horse. What? Sophia shouted in shock, stepping between Jonathan and Carrot. She's our horse. I helped raise her. We can't just leave her, Sophia protested. Jonathan knelt down, his massive frame casting a long shadow over her. He reached out his wide hand and rested his palm onto her shoulder softly. She's a very pretty horse, little lady, but she's built for soft grass and flat grounds. These mountain trails will eat her up in 2 weeks. Please don't let those trails be her grave, he said, as soft as his gravelly voice could soften. Mr. Bowman, are you sure we can't keep Carrot? Sophia loves her, Wilson asked as Sophia started crying loudly. Jonathan let out a breath as thick as mud, shaking his head. She's a foxtrotter, Mr. Godson. She's bred for speed and flat roads, not for hauling through a mountain trail. She'll blow a lung or break a cannon bone before we hit the first incline. Bill's Vanner has hooves the size of dinner plates and a chest like a furnace. It isn't a fair trade in coin, but it's a fair trade in survival. Remember Rule 4. I'd rather have a live coward than a dead hero, Jonathan explained. Mr. Bowman, are you seriously asking us to throw away what little of our home we were able to keep? Hilda shouted in furious protest, her voice echoing across the docks. We've already lost so much. We lost even more on the trip here, and now you're asking us to simply trade off what little remains, she added, her chest heaving, her fury growing more intense. Jonathan's eyes slowly drifted up to her, a knowing look in those hazel eyes. Madam, you've already lost everything. Don't trade your life for your belongings on those trails. I implore you. Things can be replaced. Lives can never be replaced, Jonathan explained, his voice calm and patient. Hilda turned on her heel and stormed into the wagon. The sound of soft crying began coming from inside the wagon. Wilson watched the dock workers move past with practiced apathy. They didn't share a glance at Sophia's tears or Hilda's grief. They simply stepped over piles of discarded harbor trash and kept their eyes on their own crates. To them, the Godsons were already ghosts. Jonathan carefully took Sophia in his free arm, as if picking up a toddler. Even as her tears fell, he passed her to Wilson and glanced towards the back of the wagon. Wilson just silently nodded his head as he carried Sophia into the back of the wagon. As Wilson was busy calming his family, Jonathan simply took Carrot's reins and led them to Bill's trade shop. Jonathan listened to the sounds of the salty spring air beating against the town, the sounds of the people going about their day, and the sounds of the women crying. Jonathan was neither amused nor pleased. He knew he was forcing them to trade away the final remnants they had, but he knew it wouldn't get them over the mountain trails alive. Survival had a price, and today it was everything they owned. Several moments later, they finally arrived at Bill's shop. It was a sturdy building with a heavy timber frame and various displays peering through the dusty windows. "We're here," Jonathan said softly before hitching Biscuit and Carrot. He turned towards the front door and started walking. Jonathan leaned down as he walked through the front door. The Godsons sat in a daze. They didn't know how many minutes ticked by before Wilson finally found the strength to lead his family off the wagon. By then, Jonathan had returned with a hearty man, the Bill he had mentioned. Jonathan simply gestured towards the wagon and the Godson family. Bill gave a solemn nod and reached out to help Hilda down. It was a bitter, somber moment as they began to unload the few things they had left to this stranger. Every crate felt heavier than it should. Although it hurt, Wilson and Hilda knew Jonathan was right. This was the only option they had left. As Bill began unloading the wagon, Jonathan emerged from behind the shop leading a massive gypsy banner. The horse pulled a heavily reinforced wagon, the Godsons' new home. It looked more akin to a small fort than transport, a grim testament to the trails ahead. The banner was draped in a half-hooded rain cloak, and its legs were protected by the same rubbery hide material. The wagon was built for punishment. Its wide tires were reinforced with studded metal bands for grip, and the heavy springs sat beneath the frame to absorb the brutal shock of the mountain trails. A thick, well-worn sailing tarp was already strapped tight over the hood, shielding the interior. To little Sophia, the sight was terrifying. The wagon looked so similar to their old one, yet it was so much larger and more formidable. Even the massive gypsy banner, steady under Jonathan's hand, dwarfed her beloved horse Carrot. Standing beside this new ironclad beast of a wagon, their old life seemed small and fragile. Sophia clutched a carrot, gazing up at the gypsy banner. Her family was finalizing the trade with Bill. their original wagon and their nimble horse Carrot in exchange for this massive mare and the reinforced mountain coach. Fanny was roughly the same height as her beloved Carrot, but the similarities ended there. Fanny was a Titan. Her chest was broad and stoked with power like a furnace, and her hooves were the size of dinner plates and were capped with heavy iron. Compared to the thin, elegant legs of Sophia's old horse, it was an engine. Looking at the iron bolted wheels of their fortified wagon, Sophia realized this was the only way they had to survive the brutal ascent towards Huntersville. Sophia held out the carrot to Fanny, waiting for her to take it. Jonathan looked at Sophia and walked over towards her, his massive hand reaching under his rain poncho. Little lady, you're trying to light a furnace with a dandelion. Give that carrot to your old horse, and give Fanny this, Jonathan said, handing her a biscuit as hard as a stone. What is it? Sophia asked, palming the heavy snack. Cornbread mixed with smoked vegetables, smoked mushrooms, salt, hard baked and glazed with honey. This'll light a fire in her furnace, Jonathan answered. Nearby, his own horse Biscuit snorted hot bursts into the salty air, demanding a treat of his own. I know, I'm coming, you big baby, Jonathan said, walking over to Biscuit. Sophia bounced the heavy snack in her palm, looking at the Titan Fanny and trying to compare her to Jonathan's horse Biscuit. As a Briton, Biscuit was far more massive and muscular than Fanny, and he simply dwarfed Carrot. This is what it would take to survive in the New World: massive beasts with the power of a furnace, heavy snacks to fuel them, and a wagon that was more akin to a mobile fort. The new frontier was truly no place for someone as small as she was. Sophia offered a final carrot to her old family horse. As the mare chomped on the treat, Sophia smoothed her mane and whispered a soft goodbye. She moved quickly then to Fanny, the gypsy vanner, lifting the heavy biscuit Jonathan had given her out. The horse let out a gleeful, muffled whinny as she inhaled the snack. In front of her, the heavy lifting was done. Her parents, Jonathan and Bill, finished strapping down the last of the gear. With the ration secure and the horses fed, the group turned their eyes towards the steep mountains trails ahead. As everyone settled into the wagon, Bill bolted back into his shop and emerged a moment later with a heavy, bronzed, hexagonal, double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. The weapon was a beast designed to survive a tumble down a rocky ravine without bending a hair. It featured a classic dual trigger mechanism, one for each barrel, and internal lock hammers to keep the action snag free. Here, Bill said, thrusting the broomstick towards Mrs. Godson. You're gonna need it on them trails. Consider it a parting gift from me. Mrs. Godson took it took the weight of it, the brass cold against her palm. "Couldn't sell the thing, could you?" Jonathan asked as Bill retreated. Bill didn't offer a word of defense. He knew that gun was heavy and stubborn, but he also knew that as long as she kept it greased, it would never fail to bark. He gave a sharp, dismissive wave over his shoulder and stepped back into his shop, the door thudding shut behind him. From her seat in the wagon, Sophia watched the giant Jonathan mount the Titan Biscuit. Jonathan's massive frame lifted his massive frame onto Biscuit's back with a practiced ease that belied his impressive weight. When Jonathan climbed into the stirrups, it wasn't just a man mounting a horse, it was a quarter-ton of solid muscle colliding with 2,000 pounds of raw pure horsepower. Any other animal would have seen its spine snap like dry kindling under the pressure, but Biscuit lived up to his breed. The massive beast didn't even quiver. He simply braced himself as Jonathan's giant frame settled onto the reinforced leather saddle with the weight of a falling boulder. He leaned forward, his hands nearly covering the width of the horse's crest as he petted him, then reached out his thick fingers to straighten the ridiculous derby hat on Biscuit's head. Jonathan looked out towards the horizon, pulling the hood of his rain poncho low over his brow before adjusting his mask. He turned back to the Godson family as they settled into the wagon, offering a brief, almost imperceptible nod with a solemn gesture towards the towering peaks of the mountains. He signaled the start. The preparations were complete. It was time for the trek through those ancient grounds, towards the promise of a new home in Huntersville. Jonathan led the way through the town, his presence carving a path as the crowds wordlessly parted for him and Biscuit. Behind them, the Godson family followed closely, caught in the wake of his guidance. Sophia took one last look at the port, the pass of the bodies, the passing bodies, the weathered timber and stone of the buildings, and the restless mechanical roar of the harbor. She had spent her whole life wishing for the clamor of the world to just stop. The shouting merchants, steam whistles, the grinding gears. It was a headache that never ended. But as they crossed the border into those hollowed trails, the silence that rushed in wasn't a relief. It was a massive weight that reminded her of that dusty book Mrs. Gibble made the class recite back home before the world broke. She could still hear that woman's sharp voice echoing the words of the poet, a warning for travelers that Sophia finally understood. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. That is the end of chapter 1.
This concludes our broadcast day.
Farewell, my love.